Hi, I'm Martin Kelly of Friends Journal, and this is another Friends Journal Quaker author chat. And today I have with me Mike Huber. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Martin. Glad to be with you.
Glad to have you with you. So, Mike has an article in this month's Friends Journal called Session Zero: Dungeons and Dragons in the Quaker Community. And let me just read off the bio here. So we know who we're talking to. For 30 years, Michael Huber told stories as a pastor at West Hill Friends Church in Portland, Oregon. He currently works as director of program for Quaker Voluntary Service. His current D&D group has met almost every week for nearly 10 years, which sounds very impressive.
It's very impressive. Um, it's sometimes said that the greatest villain in all of Dungeons and Dragons is scheduling.
Ah, I can imagine that. It must be very difficult. So before we start, though, I thought I'd get out uh, rules of discipline here. Philadelphia meeting 1843 and the gaming and diversions. So I don't
Ooh,
know
here
what
it
you're doing
comes.
here. As our time passeth swiftly away and our delight ought to be in the law of the Lord, it is advised that a watchful care be exercised over our youth to prevent their going to stage plays, horse races, music, dancing, or any such vain sports and pastimes. Now, I also went to a later one, and I'm only going to read this because it's fascinating because it could almost be like the anxiety we have for TikTok and things like this today. Oh, what are the kids doing? Among the striking characteristics of the present day are the instability and love of excitement which pervade the minds of the people. Many, even among the professors of religion, seem to be lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, looking abroad for sources of gratification. Yada yada. It's a couple pages long. Um, so tell me, why should we be allowing games of diversion in our Quaker communities, Mike?
I'm so glad you asked, Martin. Um, I'm a firm believer that human beings are designed to learn through play, that's how our brains work. That's what children do. Playing is a learning activity. And I think that fear of pleasure has been a detriment to our willingness to allow ourselves a context in which we can be playful. And that playfulness is key to learning and growth. So I'm all about playing. I think we should do it all the time. I
So
hope
tell me,
the conversation is playful. I mean, there's something about not taking yourself too seriously and being willing to experiment, to try things, to use our imagination. I think our imaginations are a very important spiritual tool. Um, we we first imagine the world we want to live in before we can live in it, and that's an act of imagination. And so let's get people's imagination working so that we can move towards the world we all want to live in.
well, and these are 19th century books that I grabbed here, and you mentioned the article Robert Barkley, who's even earlier than that. But some of the sort of caution about this has pervaded Quakers even today. And you talked about that a little, like when you first started playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, in the 80s there was a real cultural moment of like somehow there was satanic activity that was being disguised as a game that you would play with dice. I mean, there was a- an incredible level of detail. There's actually a game like Dungeons and Dragons, a role-playing game that is um, based on the idea that people are playing a game that is somehow summoning evil into the world as just sort of a way of being playful, even about that idea.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of real concern about it. And I think, like a lot of things that are new, they sort of have a moment of being a sign of the younger generation falling into, you know, disrepair and
Mm.
um, dishonor and the ways of the world. And then things sort of move on and it becomes, the next fad. And in the last, oh, I don't know, 8 or 10 years, Dungeons and Dragons has appeared like in Stranger Things, a popular Netflix show. The children in that
And I was
show.
thinking about that. In that, Dungeons Dragons is part of a gateway to, demonic forces. So that's
Well, it gives them
modern.
a language. It gives them a language to talk about it. I mean, I don't think in that show playing Dungeons and Dragons causes anything bad to happen in the narrative of the show. I mean, maybe there's some interpretation there, but that's not how I read it or, interpreted it. But I think that, they call the villain Demogorgon, which is the name of a demon in the D&D books, and it gives them some language to be able to talk about, which it's kind of a silly example because it's fiction, but I think it shows how play equipped them with language that helped them interpret their experience and take action. And that's the kind of thing that play can do.
Yeah. So how's you seen it like in the Quaker context? Things changing. 20 years ago, people weren't going to be playing D&D openly at yearly meeting, probably.
No. And now, I was pleased to hear within my own yearly meeting, Sierra Cascades yearly meeting, some young adults were getting together to play some D&D and we're announcing it through more or less official channels of organization for the yearly meeting. And then I follow New York yearly meeting on, I think, Instagram, and saw that young adults in New
Right.
York yearly meeting were also talking about Dungeons and Dragons recently. And it felt like this is such an amazing experience to suddenly, in the context of my Quaker life, which felt like it was a bit, removed from my Dungeons and Dragons life, to all of a sudden hear in a Quaker context people talking about Dungeons and Dragons. I thought, wow, this is great. If we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, I'm here for that. Let's do it.
I always love when there's people have like two geekdoms that are kind of separate. And then here, Quakers think of that as a geekdom and Dungeons and Dragons, but then for some way it works in their head that they do complement each other. And a lot of Quakers love gardening, and it's like they have gardening and they have Quakerism, and the metaphors flow back and forth for that. And so I love stories like this. How has Dungeons and Dragons sort of influenced your Quakerism, even in a kind of covert form?
Well, I think the biggest one is storytelling. I think knowing how to tell a good story, how to be a collaborative storyteller. I think those are really skills that Dungeons and Dragons taught me. I think scheduling is a big part of Dungeons and Dragons. It's kind of funny, but that's also a thing that Quakers struggle with. I don't know how many Zoom meetings you've been in where it's like, no, the third Tuesday doesn't work for me.
Right.
No, so that's kind of a silly one, but I do feel like there are some cultural overlaps between the two. But really, I think it's the collaborative nature of Dungeons and Dragons. It's sort of a yes and kind of experience, which is like improv from the world of
Improv
improv.
talks about that, right? You
Um,
don't say no as your to your partner, you say yes, and you just keep
right.
developing it further and further. Sure.
Yeah, you're trying to develop a shared world by including the stories and the characters and the ideas that everybody at the table is bringing. And there's some boundaries around that, but it's most fun when it's a very open door and we're just incorporating ideas. And I feel like Quaker meetings have sort of a similar vibe of even if someone speaks in meeting for worship and you think um, that message just doesn't speak to me today, you still hold the value of wanting to create a space where people can come and experiment with participating
Mhm.
to see what works for them and what doesn't. Maybe experimenting, like maybe the link here is really play is a kind of experimentation, and that's very Quaker language, very Quaker idea.
Yeah, and it builds on each other. I know there have been times where there was some message given in a meeting and it felt totally clunky to me. And like 10, 15 minutes later, someone uprose and expanded on that and said how wonderful it was. And that second message, I was like, oh my gosh, blows my mind.
Right,
Because we were creating this kind of collaborative
right.
way of looking at this mystery coming to us in spirituality. And the first person, it didn't quite connect for me, but the second was like just took it
Right.
up. It's so it is a shared kind of culture we're creating, even in a single hour or so of worship.
It can happen in meetings for clearness too. I've been in meetings for clearness, and maybe you have too, where someone will say something pretty vague, like, I don't know why I'm saying this, but I just can't let it go. I've got the image of probably a gardening metaphor, because you're right, a lot of Quakers do garden. And they'll say something like, of a flower in a storm. I don't know where that's coming from, but I just can't let it go. And they'll say it. And then someone, a few minutes later, or the person for whom the meeting for clearance is being held will say, wow, here's why that resonates with me. Here's what I see in that. And it is sort of that, like, um, it's not necessarily always a linear, rational process. I think part of what we hold as Quakers is that we use words to point at something that can't be completely encapsulated in words.
Right.
And so we can be pretty comfortable with, well, some people prefer a different set of words for this experience, that I think we're kind of having the same sort of experience and we can support each other in that, even if our language is different.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you've got someone at the table who is a knight in heavy armor and someone at the table who is a sneaky little mouseling rogue in a dark cloak with a pokey pin for a dagger, they're bringing different tools to the party, but they're working together to make something happen. So maybe that's something Quakers can do too.
Sure. And I'm surprised I never actually got into D&D back in the day. All my friends did. So, but somehow I managed not to do it. But now I'm intrigued here.
Not
Um,
too late, Martin. Not too late.
I'm sure I can find some people. So tell us about Session Zero, which is one of the D&D concepts you shared, and how it could be sort of translated into a Quaker metaphor, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I love about Session Zero is, even though now there are some official books within the D&D world that talk about Session Zero, this idea really arose in the community. And I feel like that's another sort of way in which the D&D world feels like a place that resonates with Quakerism, is it's community driven more than top-down driven, even though there's a corporation that holds the copyright. The community provides a lot of direction for what they want to see.
Mhm.
And there are competing systems. If Dungeons and Dragons doesn't work for you, there are other systems that you can use. D&D is kind of just a shorthand for a type of gaming that has become popular. And Session Zero is this idea that has arisen within the community to say, before we start telling our story, before that first time that we roll some dice and decide what's going to happen, let's set some parameters around what our expectations are in our time together, because we do want to be collaborative, we do want to work together, and we know that different people are coming with different sensitivities, or maybe areas of tenderness, or maybe even just hopes for what they want to get out of the game.
Mhm.
If what you're looking for is a story where the narrative is pretty thin, but you get to roll a lot of dice and try some like tactics on the battlefield, that can be really fun, but it's a different kind of gaming experience than a very story-driven game where, you know, I want to spend a lot of time thinking about how the the threat of the giants coming into down from the fjords into my hometown is a danger to the people I care about, and have that sort of like emotional um storytelling of like the threat and talking about that is a perfectly valid way to play the game. But someone showing up for that, and someone showing up to have a very tactical experience of figuring out a clever way of using the abilities that their character has to defeat every possible adversary, those are different kind of desires for what people want out of their time. So Session Zero is just a time for people to talk about that and to see, okay, how can we set up a time where what we experience is meeting the expectations that we have? What are the things that we just shouldn't bring up because it's an area of sensitivity? What do we need to make sure we hit a spotlight on because that's something people really want to do? That's um, a, a tool that the Dungeons and Dragons community has learned to try to make sure that people who are coming to the table have the experience they want. It seems like a great tool that Quakers could also use,
Yeah.
because we come together from all different backgrounds with all different kinds of sensitivities, and may have conversations around things like, how do we handle name tags? What goes on our name tags? What do we do to help visitors feel welcome? What needs to be on that? And that's the kind of conversation of, what do we need to do as a community to create a context where people are most likely to feel empowered and excited about what we might be able to do together instead of like bumping into obstacles that we didn't even intend to be there.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes Quaker communities will be sort of, I mean, I want to be sensitive, but sometimes stuck in a rut. Like, where do we have name tags or we don't have name tags because that's what we do? Like, they've sort of inherited kind of a culture. So I could see it being very useful to just sort of like sit together and talk about, well, what is it that we, those of us here today, want to do, and what ways we could be, more welcoming, or however we want to play our Quaker game,
Yeah.
whatever kind of meeting, and just also to have maybe a vision of the meeting.
I think another good example, I mean, just sort of a general question of is who is the meeting for?
Mhm.
I mean, to ask that question, there's probably more than one answer, and the answers are probably nuanced and interact with each other in interesting ways. So I know some meetings, for example, have a culture in which if you are a few minutes late to worship, there's a bit of a buffer room where you might go before actually entering the meeting for worship, because it's very important in the culture of that meeting to have silence sort of at the official start time of
Right.
meeting. Um, and so they've created a system that helps protect the people who've shown up on time for worship and want to settle into that silence. What's the experience of the people who are in the buffer room? Uh, I don't know, but having a actual conversation about like, well, what is this like for you? Are there things that we could have available in the buffer room so that that experience would be the kind of experience that we as a community want to have for you? Those all seem like very fruitful conversations that are kind of trying to be mindful about what's the experience. The way we've structured things is shaping the experience that people are having. Is it shaping the experience people are having in the way that reflects who we are and what the kind of experience that we want them to have? Or do we need to have some more conversation about that?
Yeah, that'd be great. The session zero, does this ever happen? So you say you've been in a game that's been going on for 10 years. Do you ever have like session zeros sort of in the middle of that period? Do you ever have times where you just sort of kind of take a break from the gameplay and talk about what kinds of games you want to be continuing to play?
A great question. Yeah. Over 10 years, it probably won't be surprising to learn we've started a story, kind of had it take its full arc, and then decided we're going to move on to a new story. The game master that we play with, um, he's someone who's a little bit younger than me, but he designed this world a long time ago. He read some book about a fantasy world, and he felt like there was a logistical problem in the book that he read, and so he decided to design a world so that that logistical problem was solved in his conception of how could a fantasy world really evolve to be like the way it was described in this book. So we always play the game in this world. We're familiar with the cities there. We're familiar with some of the cultures there, but we've told different stories over the years. And when we get kind of to an end of a story arc, we'll often say, okay, for the next story, what are people thinking about? What sounds fun? And we might say, you know what, for the next one, let's be pirates. Let's set up a story where we're on a ship and there's some kind of cargo that's going from one place to another that is morally gray enough that we can feel justified about stopping the ships and making a little money, but also kind of living this adventurous life on the sea, have more encounters that are ocean based instead of going down into a cave or climbing up into the mountains or something else like that. In that sense, even for an established group, you might come back to a session zero as one arc ends and you get ready to start the next arc.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the idea of a story arc for a friends meeting or church, what that would look like. And meetings, and they do go through cycles. And to really
Absolutely.
perhaps name that cycle, we're in a period where kids of a certain generation are gone, and the small kids aren't there anymore, or there's a bunch of new people who have been coming in for the past year. Maybe we should be really focusing on more religious ed, thinking about the cycles of the life of our meeting would be kind of interesting, and thinking of them as story arcs. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think in my branch of the family tree, where it's more common to have a pastor who's part of the community life, I think a pastoral transition is definitely a story arc.
Yeah.
It's a beat in the story of like, this was someone that we invited into our community because we collectively felt like this was the direction we wanted to go, and this was someone who could help us get there. Now that we're making a transition, what's the next story going to look like? That story will change again at some point.
Yeah.
Um, and it's great. It's great to, it seems to me anyway, that it's great at those moments of starting something new to be really mindful. And then um, I think you sort of get to a place where you think, well, um, we thought it was going to go this way, so that's how we set it up. But now people have actually shown up, and they're adding a little bit of a different voice to the conversation than we anticipated. And
Well, they
so
are. Yeah.
just an
Hopefully they're
ongoing
bringing in
process.
something new. Right.
Yeah, it's an ongoing process. But some of it is there's like a sense of identity or a sense of what's normative.
Hmm.
Um, and all session zero really does is say, let's put that on the table and really look at it so that we're not just defaulting to a pattern because we inherited it.
Yeah.
Let's make sure that we're doing something mindful with what we're attempting.
What meeting is the little mouse and what meeting is the giant gnome?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike. This has been a great talk. And for viewers, this is an article. It's for free here on French Journal, again, called Session Zero in the August 2024 issue of French Journal. So go check it out. And thanks, Mike. Thanks for being up for this interview.
Yeah. Thanks for your interest. I appreciate it.